Hey everyone, welcome back to Notice That, an EMDR podcast. Bridger and I are here today in the studio with a special interview.
Yes.
We've gotten to do several of those lately, which has been exciting. But yeah, our interviewee is joining in through virtual connection. So we have some exciting things to talk about.
Very exciting. Yeah, I've been looking forward to we've had this one on the calendar for a while.
Yeah.
So I've been looking forward to this, and then November came and it's like, oh my gosh, it's the time.
Yeah.
This is going to be amazing. Yeah, so this is super exciting. And I think in this conversation, we'll get to tie in and speak very directly to some of the things that have been really central to our theoretical development through somatic integration and processing, our case conceptualization model, and then also just to the way we approach EMDR therapy.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about that.
Okay, so with no further delays, we would love to introduce you to Arielle Schwartz. We have a great opportunity to ask lots of questions and get to talk a little bit more about some topics that are really important to the way that we conceptualize with EMDR. So welcome, Arielle. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be with you both.
Yeah, typically I just love to have our guests introduce themselves in whatever way they want to be known. So if you would please, for our listeners, those that know you and may not know you, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'll share first where I'm located. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I've been here for about 30 years. I'm originally from New York, and I moved out to Boulder. It kind of helps orient to who I am. I moved out to Boulder in 1996. Initially to study somatic psychology. So I came out here with that intention. There was basically at the time really 3 programs in the country that had master's degrees in somatic psychology, and one of them was here in Boulder at Naropa University. So that's what brought me here, and then I met my husband, and I've been here ever since. So I graduated from that program in 1999, and I've been working as a somatic therapist for many, many years. I then trained in EMDR therapy in 2001. And I trained in what I felt like was just such a blessing of a training, because it was a small group of us, right? Like it wasn't one of those huge, huge trainings. We had, I think, 20 or 21 of us in the training. And it was so intimate, and as everyone here, I'm going to assume, is very familiar, is that we have those opportunities to learn a modality and then to practice it, right? To have those experiences of just really deepening into how do we embody this modality.
Yeah.
But it was so interesting to come at EMDR from already being a body-centered psychotherapist.
I bet.
Because I feel like it gave me just like right from the get-go a different lens into what's possible. And so much of my early experiences receiving EMDR as a client were deeply integrated. Like I couldn't separate out all of the felt sense that was happening here with kind of like the cognitive integration and the moving through the memory process. So I feel like because I was somatically trained first, coming into even my own experiences of EMDR as a client, let alone as a practitioner, there was just so much tracking and observing and being with the felt sense experience and letting that felt sense really be such an important gauge of that sense of completion or resolution. And then, of course, the cognitive integration around that. So, kind of there's a little bit of like the beginning flavors of the intersection of all of this. And that goes back to 2001, 2002. As I continued to train and evolve in my work, I brought in more applied polyvagal theory and interpersonal neurobiology, went back to school, got a doctorate in clinical psychology, and looked at how do we integrate mind-body therapies into clinical practice, and including EMDR and somatics as mind-body therapies.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're both already fall into that category.
So I'm curious, back when you first entered into like the world of EMDR, was your experience of that one where it felt like a modality coming in that really was in alignment or representative of the somatic approach that you had learned in your practice, or was that kind of a task that you took on of how do we incorporate and be more intentional with a somatic integration to the EMDR protocol?
I think that I've seen a little bit of both over the years. Like if I were to speak about like in what ways is EMDR very aligned with my somatic background, in what ways have I seen EMDR be taught or practiced in ways that lose that alignment, right? And so, initially the training that I received, I feel like was very much in alignment. I think it sometimes has to do with who is your trainer, right?
Yeah.
And that particular trainer really emphasized the body scan and the sensing of the body and the check-ins. And so what are you noticing now? Not just in image or in a cognition, but what are you feeling now? What's happening in here? And so that, for me, it lent itself to a pretty seamless blend early on. Whereas I've been a supervisor and a consultant for literally hundreds and hundreds of EMDR therapists. And I hear many that are coming through getting very cognitively oriented or based trainings where they're not emphasizing nearly as much about that somatic integration. So, so I think that in those cases, when I'm doing consultation and supervision and we're talking about my book or when we're integrating that, they're going to get like, oh, wow, that was the missing piece. And that's the piece that I get all the time. Like, that was the missing piece. That's why things aren't clearing, or that's why there's this like relational disconnect in the room.
Yeah. I'm curious just to kind of go back a bit onto discussion of your interest even in moving to Boulder and beginning your practice as I want to go to this program, and like what kind of was a value for you that you saw in that?
I love that you asked, like, was it value driven at some level?
Right.
And I have to say, like, I don't really think that it was value driven. First off, it was almost like driven by my body itself.
Oh, wow.
Right. If you think of value driven being a little top down, like I had so much of how I process the world was very much through my own soma, and in, the good, the bad, and the ugly of that. But like, that was basically just so much of what drew me to study somatics in the first place, in the sense that that's where I felt most of my trauma got stuck, was more through somatization. And then also where I felt most freedom was through movement and through yoga and being in nature and dance and like things that allowed me to be with my body in some really essential ways. And so I don't know, if I even knew yet all of the why, but by the time I was complete with my somatics program, like there was everything in me that was just like, this is so clearly my path. And that's why when I went back to my doctoral program and I began to formally study a lot more about the why, like why do mind-body therapies work? How do they work? How do they change us? And why are they important? And what are the barriers to integrating mind-body therapies into clinical practice?
Yeah.
Where would you say, and this I hope this isn't taking us like too far ahead in the conversation, we can always come back, but just even naming that, like what are some of the areas where it feels like EMDR and somatic approaches have such a natural alignment? We hear often things like, body scan or check in with the body as we're processing, but in what ways does it feel like it has a really natural fit? And then in what ways does a standard protocol have a potential to kind of create conflict or like a difficulty in really honoring and incorporating the experience of the body?
Yeah. So many, many years ago, like I really want to go back like 20 years ago, there was a kind of rumor that I think had come out of the somatic experiencing community that some way or another, EMDR led trauma to become a little bit more stuck in the soma, more stuck in the body. If it didn't incorporate somatic practices or movement or breath awareness or postural awareness or body awareness more. And I honestly think there is a risk for that. Right? Like that there is some way in which when we're not really prioritizing not just body awareness, but, like if I go back to a little bit of a frame from somatic experiencing, somatic experiencing would say that like sometimes what gets stuck in the body or the nervous system is what didn't get to complete.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I get to call for help or reach for connection.
Mm.
If we look through that lens of like that, part of what helps us feel the sense of completion of a process is that there's some way in which the movement that didn't get to happen at the time of the trauma needs to find its way to completion. Right. So that really got something started in me that when Barb Mayberger and I wrote the EMDR and somatic psychology book, and before we wrote that, we'd been teaching that as a training for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we started doing advanced EMDR courses in EMDR and somatic psychology. And after 10 years of teaching this and piloting it and kind of getting really, really familiar on how do we integrate across these two modalities, then I turned to her one day and I was like, we got to write a book on this. Like, it's time, it's ready. We have the model. But it took a good 10 years of developing that model.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And part of that is taking advantage, and this is something that's counterintuitive for those of us that are trained traditionally in EMDR, because so often we're trained just to go right back in, go with that, right? And that there's a way in which actually the pause between the sets, when we pay attention to the body, that we can ask another question, which is what wants to happen next, right?
Mm.
If you let your body take the lead, what needs to happen next? Because very often prioritizing that felt sense, there is a knowing of what needed to happen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm with that. Just even thinking about the actual moment where you're checking in and saying, where, does your body feel you want to go next? I imagine that to be sort of all throughout the process, not just in the phase 4, you're checking in, what do you get now? The client is reporting, and then that being the only place where that type of comment is made. I would imagine that represents a deeper, even conceptualization of what is happening with the trauma in the body.
So, when we are taking our time on the front end and we slow it down and we notice what is happening, let's say like we're going through a little bit of an arc of the event and we have different images that are linked to those worst parts or specific elements of the event, that we can also pause and say, and how does your body register that? Or what are you noticing here? And we might hear like there's a gripping in the jaw or a clenching, or that there's a tightness in the throat, or that there's a feeling around the chest or around the belly, or I notice my hands are gripped, right? So if we slow down and really notice these sometimes subtle or not so subtle somatic experiences, they're going to help guide us in how we want to deepen towards where the trauma is held. They're also going to guide us in how to release it.
Mm. Yeah. To me, I hear this like shift between, is somatic like this thing we incorporate, where we do a body scan or we check in with the body and it's like a box that we're checking, and more of a shift into this is a way that we are looking at the human and their presentation and their expression. As it's one of the main sources of wisdom as we do this work to understand how do we follow its guidance into where the pain is, where the distress is held, where the wounding is, but then also that like path of healing. How do we release it? What is it that was needed? You mentioned even like movement and like the path out of being trapped and stuck in the pain of those experiences.
Yeah, 100%. Like I think about a few things in response to what you're saying. One is that as a clinician, as an EMDR therapist, part of what we want to emphasize is that the somatic practices are not just the interventions that we're doing for the other. Mm. They are the foundation of our attunement and our presence. And so when we are also embodied, if you want to call it that way, or sensing and feeling within ourselves, it's going to help us track what's happening in the room. It's going to help us set the pacing. We're going to notice the subtle or not so subtle shifts happening in our own experience as we're sitting with another person. And that's going to help guide the healing process as well. So that's kind of a layer of something that I feel like is so valuable for us to get comfortable with.
Yeah. And I think that's a great kind of bring one of the voices I'm hearing from a lot of the consultation work that I do, which is I hear clinicians and talk to a lot of them that want to bring more of an embodied presence to their EMDR work, or even just promote the connection between the mind and the body for their clients. And they feel like they get stuck when the client says, in response to, where do you feel that in your body? They say, what do you mean? Or they show some type of inability to access that experience. And I think there's a conceptualization of what that is, of just trying to tell the story of the nervous system throughout the person's life. But when it actually comes to the room and you have this now kind of micro rupture between therapist and client, of the therapist wanting to help the client access felt sense in the body, and the client saying like, I can't do that.
Yeah. And part of that is actually like, there's two things that I hear in response. One is that even in terms of like a sign of readiness for doing phase 3, phase 4 work, I actually want to already know that the client feels comfortable with that question.
Right.
So that we don't suddenly get into phase 4 and I ask this question of, what are you noticing in your body? And they're like, I have no idea. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, I'd like to actually have already built the foundation between us that that's going to be a question that they're going to hear on a regular basis. And then the second thing that I hear in response to that question is that not feeling your body is the answer.
Right.
Right. Like, sometimes we or our clients might feel like, if I can't sense and feel what's happening in here, then I'm doing it wrong. But actually, if you're not sensing and feeling what's happening in your body, that in itself is often a signal or the symptom of the trauma. And so then we pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of to connect to the embodiment of the therapist as well, I hear in that question, my curiosity peaks towards, how is that registering for the clinician? Are we approaching somatic work from a top-down experience of like, okay, what's the answer to that? And what do I need to say differently? Or are we able to encounter that more from an embodied place and checking in with like, what does that bring up in our own systems when we hit that kind of block, or when our clients are very disconnected to the experience of their body? And what does that then add? What are we adding into the space, into that dynamic that's maybe further influencing our ability to talk about the body, respond to, or incorporate that in our work?
There's something about it. I love what you brought in before too, Bridger, about this idea of the rupture, right? Like that there's something about being not just two minds in a room, but two embodied beings in a room. And when we look through the lens of somatics, and I'm going to pull from a different somatic tradition, I really work not just with one somatic approach, but across multiple modalities.
Right.
And so this one is drawn from sensory motor psychotherapy. And there's this perspective that Pat Ogden offers that when we're sitting with another person in the room, we are doing a shared embodied mindfulness experience.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I'm watching what's happening in here. I'm inviting you to watch what's happening in there. And I'm also using my observational capacities to notice subtle things like a change in your posture, or to notice that you're holding your breath, or to notice that you just looked away. And all of those nonverbals become a very key component of what helps the session be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so much information in what isn't said. So much more to the space between the words, or the things that aren't showing up with language necessarily. That I think even as a clinician who later in my career learned more about somatic work, that felt very overwhelming to me at first, as I started to realize how little is held in words and how much is held in nonverbal expressions. Was kind of like probably an indication of my lack of embodiment.
Well, I think, and just, sorry, I'm getting excited because to me, I felt the same way. And I think that it was because I don't know, if we can't put it into language, I don't know how to access it.
That's what it felt like. Yeah.
To me at the time,
what do?
I just don't know. And so I want to honor the fact that it lives there. And my background in neuroscience confirmed over and over and over again that that's where the trauma actually is. But at the time, I thought, if we can't put it into language, I don't know how to access it. Having been trained in EMDR, trained in psychotherapy, like I just had no language. And I think that's what sent me into sensory motor psychotherapy, was the first kind of interest of just, well, let's go see people that claim to know how to, how to interact with it. But I just didn't really know.
And it's such an overwhelming amount of, and there's like the caution of, it's not our job to interpret what the body is communicating, but it's like, oh, like every glance matters, eye contact or lack of eye contact, movement, lack of movement. There's just so much depth of information when we start holding value on that.
Yeah, it's so true. And I love that you shared your own like initial overwhelm of like, oh my gosh, it's so much to pay attention to in the room. Right? Yeah. And that's a pretty normal feeling of like initially with this invitation to feel like, wait, hang on a second. I was just describing this to someone else, that it's like switching channels of like, I've been in the channel of communication through narrative and verbal processing. Mm-hmm. And now I have to switch into the nonverbal channel, and I have to learn to be comfortable with suspending the mental need to know, or to apply a description or apply a story, and to really just purely be with the sensate experience. And Bridger, to your point about how do we help someone access that, right? Because it can feel foreign, both for ourselves or for another, when we first kind of look down at the body, right? Like it's way down there from the brain. And we're like, what is that thing down there, right? And how do we get comfortable with that? And so let's say we do notice one small change.
Yeah.
Let's, a postural change, a breath change, a gestural change, a gaze change. A different somatic teacher, I'm going to pull out a few of my mentors over the years, and this is a woman by the name of Christine Caldwell. She founded the somatic psychology program at Naropa. And one of the ways that she describes deepening into that awareness of a somatic experience is to exaggerate it, to amplify it, to really get to know it. So let's say, for example, that you do notice a gripping in the jaw. Follow it. Let it get bigger in your awareness. If you do notice a subtle gripping in your fists, really follow it. Get more contracted around it, so we can deepen. If we're noticing the tendency for the breath to get shallow, pause around it. Really get to know what that feeling encompasses for you.
Yeah.
So some of it is a pacing change, and some of it is a motoric change, where, like, if we go to posture, and I'll turn to the side for a moment, but if we notice this, what happens if we exaggerate that postural shape?
Yeah.
Really get to know, what are the emotions, what are the memories, and sometimes we literally can take a somatic experience and light up an entire target from there.
Yes, this is something that I talk about so much in consultation. So I just want to camp out here for a second, because for therapists that might report, I think of it as like a sensitivity spectrum in the way their client is reporting from. On the left side is, I have no felt sense. I don't know what you're talking about. There's preparation and resourcing that we can do, activities. I do a lot of like standing and sitting with my clients, like telling them, let's try and see what's kind of down there, if that feels able and interesting. But then all the way up to this affect phobia that I have so much when I do feel it is totally overwhelming, that there's this spectrum of ability, of ease, of challenge, of comfort, familiarity, a lot of these things that, what if we just accessed it for, I think of it like, what if it's only out of like a 2 out of 10 right now, and we're just starting to really sense and hear what it's trying to tell us? What if we did exaggerate, whether it's a movement-oriented exaggeration, or open up the ears and the felt sense to see what more could there be? So like you're saying, these emotions that are there, the memories that might be there, an entire target's worth of information, all held just peeking through the surface in this one little felt sense.
Yeah, super brilliant. And I think it also speaks to something that I see as maybe a misinterpretation of some of classic EMDR, which is that the SUD should always go down.
Right.
Yes.
We talk about this in our basic training all the time.
Yeah.
Good, because most people don't. And it's so important to recognize that, especially if someone has the dissociative subtype of PTSD, which is in which they are already dialing down their somatic experience. And you can look at the work of Ruth Lanius to understand better dissociative subtype, right? And so for that individual, when we start to open up somatic processing and somatic awareness, much more likely that we're actually going to notice that SUDS of a 2 all of a sudden bumps up to a SUDS of a 7 or 8 before it comes back down. That in this case could be a sign of really good therapy.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes EMDR clinicians get a little bit confused in that moment of like, why did it get worse? What am I doing wrong? And if we're carrying that, then we might inadvertently be communicating to the client that big affect actually isn't welcome with us.
Right.
Or that big sensation isn't welcome here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hangups with just the protocol without the context, is it kind of sets that up when you scale something 0 to 10. And it's this implicitly understood agenda that we hold to say, okay, our goal is to get to a 0. I talk to consultees often and basic trainees of like, establish like, what's our intention? The SUD scale is a great way to measure where distress is at, but the goal, could we name what it is first? We may have several sessions where the intention is to actually start to access this suppressed affect or to be aware of the distress that's held. And we can have an 8 on the SUD score and that represents it, but that might meet our goal. That might be a successful session or several sessions if we're kind of identifying that together at the beginning.
Yeah, really powerful. And sometimes if clients get, again, like too caught up in their heads about a number, I just drop it, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that it's so important to be flexible with this protocol. And if we get, same thing, like if we get too caught up in the cognitions, and it's one of the things that I love about Laurel Parnell's work is that like there's times where we're doing a beautiful assessment phase and we're setting up the target or the focus for session, and we've gotten in there and there's a felt sense in the body and there's emotion, and then we pop back up to get the cognition or a number and we've lost that juice.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think those are really helpful acknowledgments for people who are more newly trained in EMDR or maybe are newly trained in incorporating somatics, is to help them realize like some of the smallest changes that we can make that feel like, oh no, this would be a betrayal of EMDR, but to say, no, there's actually so much space for flexibility, but to recognize, does asking a cognition support what we're attempting to do, or is it actually a limiting factor to what we're trying to access?
Beautiful. Yeah, that's the kind of flexibility that I think is so deeply valuable, and it's relational. So when we look at the original intentions of Francine Shapiro, relationality is built into the model.
Yeah.
Somatic is built into the model. And I really believe that it was always meant to be a flexible model. And sometimes I think it got a little bit too close to traditional CBT or traditional exposure therapies, and we lost some of that messaging.
Yeah. And I want to go back to you talking about the distress. Sometimes there's this expectation that the distress always needs to go down. And that was something that was there kind of in my basic training of, I got the sense that, okay, we're on this SUD scale, so we need to be moving that down. That's our most reliable indicator. Like that's what I remember taking back after the basic training into my practice. And it wasn't really until I started using it with clients, number one, but the first time I heard somebody really talk about the fact that distress might need to go up before it releases was in my polyvagal training of talking about the way the nervous system actually functions. And if we're in this collapsed dissociative dorsal vagal state, we actually need to upregulate into sympathetic activation, which could feel terrible to that person because they're living in their home away from home. That was Deb Dana's language of, I'm living in this dorsal collapsed space where I don't want to feel anything at all. So when I actually open up to feeling, it feels terrible and fiery and rage filled, and I'm just so concerned I'm breaking all of these rules around myself, but maybe that's what actually needs to happen.
So beautiful. And I love that you started to bring in the polyvagal work because it's so central to, I think, everything that I do at this stage.
Yeah.
And especially kind of, again, like reaffirming or reconfirming that like climbing that polyvagal ladder
Exactly.
out of a dorsal vagal collapse might be the increase in SUDs and increase in felt sense discomfort. And that might be the route, the very direct route up to healing that we need to do. And again, it's inherent within our somatic modalities too.
Yeah, that's a great kind of intersection to me because as somebody that, I don't consider myself necessarily a somatic practitioner, but I really think through lots of different integration opportunities of looking at the human being holistically, of which the somatic lens is essential. But as a somatic practitioner, have you found, I'm sort of asking this tongue in cheek because I know you do because you write on this all the time, but have you found that polyvagal theory is articulating the felt sense of what you've been doing in your somatic work? And what do you find in the polyvagal kind of theory camp that feels really validating?
Yeah. It's a good time to talk about this because I literally just came back from spending last week with Steve Porges and the whole Polyvagal Institute team down at the International Congress or the conference that happened. And one of my favorite takeaways from this conference of this year was a discussion by Dr. Porges about his current conceptualization of how trauma gets, he used the word tagged in the nervous system or stuck in the nervous system. So one thing, and I'll try and summarize a few key points that really landed for me. Yeah. One is that he spoke about how ideally our nervous system is very fast acting, right? We experience something, we neurocept it, or we perceive a threat out there, and we go into threat response.
Yeah.
And ideally, we come out of that threat response very quickly as well. Right. So, an example that I've been using since the conference is like imagine a bunny or rabbit and it hears a rustling behind the bushes in the leaves. Right. And so the rabbit's going to go into freeze. It's going to listen. It's going to be vigilant. Is that a fox? Right. What comes out from under the leaves is a mouse. No threat. Very quickly, the rabbit's going to come out of that threat response and off it goes being a bunny. Right. So why is it that at times as humans, we get stuck in nervous system states, and how does trauma contribute to that? So one of the things that Steve said is that not only does the nervous system tag or register this external thing, in this case, the sound of the rustling, right, as a potential threat, but especially when that threat poses life threat, massive danger, it's very important for our nervous systems to tag that and to be able to relocate it as needed, right? Yeah. And the way, and this is what was fascinating to me, is that not only are we tagging the exteroceptive sensing of a sound that we hear or something that we see, or a felt sense that happens in touch, which, our five senses are exteroceptive sensing, but that the nervous system also can tag the interoceptive felt sense.
Yeah.
And so now what gets linked to the trauma is what I feel in my body.
Yeah.
And it becomes an internal feedback loop.
Right.
So that anytime I feel that sensation, it's being registered, and I want to say very often non-consciously registered.
Yeah.
By the brainstem, by the brain, as a threat. And sometimes I'm aware of what I'm responding to as threatening, and sometimes I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Really, really like that language of tagging. It just kind of helps connect for me. Very friendly language, this idea of that our systems are tagging these felt experiences internally or senses externally, almost like pinning something like, quick messaging, quicker to respond to, a faster response pattern if we have them tagged, versus having to sort through everything and say, how do I compare this to like all of the information that's stored in here? but those quick reference makes us much faster in our reaction, whether it's an accurate fit or not, but allows us to respond much more quickly.
100%. And when we look at what is the health or the balance of our autonomic nervous system, it's the ability to move relatively fluidly between a sympathetic state of mobilization and a parasympathetic rest.
Right.
But what happens when we experience trauma is that we get stuck, right? We get stuck in that vigilance or that high arousal sympathetic, or vice versa, we get stuck in a parasympathetic shutdown, a collapse of fatigue, a withdrawal, an urge to hide, an urge to get small. In either case, we've lost that autonomic flexibility.
Yeah. I'm curious for you, and if it's polyvagal theory is what you've been focusing on, I would love to continue this conversation as we've gone. But since that publication, I believe it was 2018, that EMDR therapy and somatic psychology came out, since then, has EMDR just been, I'm thinking of it almost as like a party to that ongoing development, or do you feel like you're kind of shifting what you do based on the person that comes in the room? Like, how do you kind of conceptualize what actually goes into your practice?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid question, because I feel like there's some things that I have learned over the years that have really deeply shaped how I work now.
Yeah.
Not that I don't work with EMDR therapy, I do, but I don't know that it looks very much like classic EMDR therapy. And so I would say that like one of the big pieces is that so much can resolve and heal through a felt sense experience in the here and now of safety and connection.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If we can cultivate sufficient nervous system integration of a resource, right? Embodied resource. It's almost like I finally feel safe enough that I can actually let go of what I was holding on to.
Yeah.
Right. I'll give just even like a super brief example, but my stepfather has been in surgery today, and he's a very, very important, special person to me in my life. And I, for about 3 days, have just noticed that I've been like running at a higher caliber for myself. Like I typically I'm a great sleeper. I meditate. I love my meditations. Meditation's been painful the last 3 days because I'm just sitting there like, really? There's that many thoughts in my head right now? Like, what's going on? And I got on my yoga mat this morning, and I knew that I was on my yoga mat right as he was going into surgery. And I got into pigeon pose, right? And a hip opener, and I burst into tears. But where I felt safe in the room and where my mind took me was loving kindness practice. Loving kindness for myself, loving kindness for my mom, who I also know is worried about him, loving kindness for my stepfather, so that he is kind of imagined him surrounded by this kind of bubble of love as he's in surgery. Loving kindness for my husband, who's out there supporting him right now. And it was like just melting of like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that's why I was running up here.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, just an hour ago, I got the text. He's out. All went well. He's going to be fine. And then I just texted back, exhale.
Yeah.
Like, whew.
Yeah.
And just this feeling of like, okay, everything that I was non-consciously carrying that's been keeping me at this higher caliber can finally begin to soften and let down. And so bringing this back, why do I share this story? But tying it back into what I notice in my work is that, we think in EMDR about our preparation phase, or our phases kind of 1 and 2 of building rapport and building resource development and all of that. Like, I spend way more time there.
Yeah.
And that even when I'm going into phase 3, phase 4 work, very often it's a pendulation between phase 2, phase 4.
Yeah.
Phase 2, phase 4, right? And that if by the time we get into phase 4, we've lost that robust access to resource, and we're leaving the window, whatever language we want to call that. Like if it's stopping AIP, if it's stopping the adaptive information processing, back to 2.
Right.
Yeah. That the way that you're talking about your practice and how, to a fly on the wall, it may not look like a single session or series of sessions may not look like what the basic training videos look like. I think just really opens up for people to see that standard approach, that standard protocol. There's a lot of value of like foundation of learning, but as we get in and we really understand what those phases are about and what those specific questions and techniques do, and integrate it with more somatic experiencing, parts work, CBT, like all of the others. It's how do we blend this and recognize that this is not like therapy and healing is not about alignment with a script or a protocol. It's a human dynamic. It's about being in a space of relational safety, connection, and being able to allow our nervous systems to kind of like click back in and have that moment of expression or that reparative healing experience for it to be open to receive and to release. And that happens in safe connection, safe relationship. And a lot of these protocols and techniques are supportive in helping a therapist learn how to do that or provide some sense of guidance or insight, but they don't necessarily have to be rigidly adhered to in order to find healing.
Yeah, super beautiful. And, I think a lot of the metaphors that I've been using lately, whether we use a braiding metaphor across different modalities, like of, some parts work and somatic work and EMDR and relational resourcing and the cognitive approaches, like they're braided together. Another metaphor I use is a highway metaphor of like, we've got all these lanes on the highway and I've been trained in parts work and I've been trained in somatics. I've been trained in EMDR, right? All this stuff. And like the way that I like to guide folks is that like you can actually change lanes, but they're all the same highway.
Yeah. Yeah. They're going in the same direction.
Love that.
I love that. I also want to take this moment to talk about something that, I get a lot in consultation as well, which is, I think, something that the here and now focus of somatic work, at least as I experience it in consultation, of what is the utility of that kind of perspective for functional change in the individual's life with the sort of things that get triggered in a trauma, post-trauma kind of growth experience. And that's where that feeling of being safe that you alluded to on your yoga mat, that moment of release, that exhale, that to me has so much power in the here and now, yes. But my focus is also how can we take that into the rest of the day, the rest of the week in between session, that it's not just, okay, in this moment right now, I had that and that's all that it really means, but let it really marinate and sit with, okay, this is not just a here and now thing. This is something that could be there for so many other moments as well. Does that feel possible? And that's where I talk with consultees about the future template really is, to me, an underutilized resource for really focusing on things for your clients.
Totally. In the EMDR and somatic psychology book, Barb Mayberger and I refer to something called a golden nugget practice. And I love to share this one. I see you're familiar with it. And but what it really does is it says, you know what, too often, at least in how I was initially trained in EMDR, we don't do installation phase and we don't get to that 3-pronged protocol of how do you bring this into your life now and how would you like to feel in the future. We don't do that till we get to a SUD 0.
Right.
But if we wait, we have so many lost opportunities. And so what you're describing is let's take hold of each of these positive shifts and integrate them.
Yeah.
And create these opportunities to really imagine bringing that out of the session and into your life.
Yeah. Do you have an example I can come up with one, but I'm just curious, even with like the golden nugget moment of being with somebody, because I think this is where this practice moves from conceptual of like, yeah, EMDR parts work, somatic, that sounds beautiful. But this gets really practical when we start thinking about, okay, here's a client that's in a complex trauma treatment process. These sessions are not like slam dunk moments where it's just like, oh yeah, we took care of that target and we got all this stuff cleared and everything's great. Like maybe I should own it. That's not my experience.
Mine either. You're not alone.
Right. But in those processes, I have found it essential to cultivate that momentum of progress and fullness feeling in the body, that we have to look at, even if we moved it from, again, an arbitrary SUD scale, but like an 8 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10 today, and we can tangibly identify what the feeling was of each shift that happened, that is sufficient for installation and future template. Like those are the moments we cannot wait. Just as you're saying, especially with a complex or developmental trauma case, you're not going to get to a 0 out of 10 on some of these things. So what does that say if we're reserving all of these future template integration exercises for that moment that will never come? Like, to me, we have to be thinking about this progress is beautiful. It's so meaningful. And I see it as like an ember that I just want to like nurture and let it take fire.
So funny. I love the ember image because I used to learn. I worked many years ago in wilderness work, and we would learn how to do bow drill fires, right? And we would learn how to make a little nest for the ember out of like juniper bark or soft bark, and then we would put it in there. We would just like blow on that ember until we had this solid flame to start a fire.
That's so funny. I just want to share my Aunt Marty is somebody that lived with indigenous tribes in California for a really long time. And she brought me, I loved this as a little kid. I was like 5 years old. She brought me fire from Arkansas, and it was in a little like bundle. I'm not sure what it's called exactly, but I just was blown away by this, that she brought fire from like the Fayetteville, Arkansas area to Midwestern Kansas, that I was just like, this is incredible. So I think that's always the tangible link that comes to me with this ember idea, that even if it's small and even if it's, like barely a fire right now, there's still so much hope and power in that.
That's profound. I love that image, and what a gift! What a gift to have received as a young child. And you were kind of leaning into an example. I'll give an example. It's a client whose work I've recorded for the purpose of trainings, and one thing that actually strikes me when I go back and I look at our work together, we used very sporadic bilateral stimulation.
Yeah.
It's CPTSD. And she could very easily move towards flooding. Like she was more on the under-contained side of that continuum from over-contained to under-contained. And so in this particular session that we recorded together, there was a target that we were working with around really early abandonment. Like nobody was coming, nobody was looking at me, nobody was going to pick me up. And we, in this particular session, were working with a combination of somatic work, right? Noticing what was happening with her body, with her breath, with some pain in her back, significant nausea that was coming up in the session, as well as parts work, because she had a felt sense repulsion towards this part of her that was carrying this deep wound of rejection. And this very strong interject of who could love this child, right?
Yeah.
Now, there's this phenomenal shift that happens during the session where there's this moment where we do a classic interweave. You think of it as a parts work interweave, but if we imagined a different child in a similar circumstance, what do you imagine that child would need, right? Love, care, affection, to be held, to be seen. And then, could you imagine that would be the birthright of any child? Absolutely, right? Could you imagine turning towards your own child self with that same quality of care and compassion and kindness? It was available, right? So now we had gold in the session, and we started to move towards this really, really powerful imagery that came to her of her here now self holding that young part. And in fact, at one point, she's in the session as if she has that young part in her arms, and she has the most beautiful, loving gaze towards that part, like the most beautiful. It was so palpable.
Wow.
And so I dropped the SUDs altogether. Like I'm not even going to worry about that, because the truth is, with complex PTSD, that is a very deep and so many layers of conditioning around that particular wound that we're up against. But now we had a little golden nugget of this felt experience, of her so lovingly able to hold and really feel, and she could go back and forth between being the young self receiving that love and being the adult offering that to that part of herself. Wow. And then the golden nugget is, how would you like to take that out into the world with you?
Perfect.
Right? And what was really striking is that, like, one of the things that she said is that it can come up sometimes when she's parenting her son, and that, right, not uncommon, right? And like that feeling of like, oh, he's going to hold me back, or, he's going to slow me down, or blah, blah, blah. And, and that feeling of wanting to push him away. And so as we reincorporated that into her identity as a mother, it became so accessible of how she wanted to show up for him. Amazing, right? So like that would be an example of that integration in that future movie, right?
Beautiful example.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing a story like that, because I think it's so helpful to take some of these concepts and anchor them into how that shows up with a real client. But that concept of finding the golden nugget and having that, we don't have to go back to the formal script of like, how do we wrap up a session? But that's what we're looking for when we're talking about stabilization, containment, complace, at the end of our session. Like, what if that shift is a more natural moment that emerges, and we say, we use the metaphor of like, we start the landing, we land the plane with what kind of organically emerged there. Like, let's start our descent here and look at how we can integrate that into the week, how we can really carry that with us outside of session.
Yeah. So stunning. And, even in the example that I just gave, like the felt sense, and this is literally what she says at the end of the session. So if any of you ever come do a training with me, you'll see the Wendy session. And she literally says, I'm giving away the ending, but she says, it's not up here. It's here. I feel it in my body. Like, she was surprised.
Yeah.
But she kept saying, it's not here. It's here. And that's what we're going for.
That's so lovely. I'm conscious of where we're at with time. And I'm curious if there is anything that you want to share with the listeners about what you're currently kind of doing with all of our guests. We'd like to try to provide a space where if they want to stay in touch with you or engage with you in the things that you're really excited about that you're doing, to provide a space for you to get to talk about that. So is there anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, there's a few things that I love to put out there about how I feel like my work is shaped right now, and what I'm super excited about. Every year I do a somatic EMDR training. It's with Embody Lab, so that's out there as a resource. There is the other thing that I'm super jazzed about is that I create these retreat experiences, and mostly around nervous system regulation, and some that are around the integrative model. So I have therapist retreats that I run down in Sedona, and next year we're doing 2 in Sedona and 1 in Costa Rica. So that's super fun.
Lovely.
Wow.
I know. So and what's so beautiful about it is that we integrate like therapeutic yoga and vagal toning practices and learning about the integrative approach to EMDR. So it's a very holistic integration, but it's very much about self-care for therapists. So I've got those. And then I also have, for anyone, you don't have to be a therapist for this, nervous system care retreats. They're called the Beyond Trauma retreats. And one of them in May is in South Africa. And if you're inclined to go to South Africa, the cool thing about it is that not only do we learn about nervous system regulation, and we do yoga in ancient riverbeds, which is phenomenal, but we then get to go on safari and we get to watch the animals in the wild, and we get to really observe the nervous system that's intrinsic to our biology, our neurobiology, and we get to see it in action. It's just incredible.
Yeah, mind-blowing.
I would like to do all of those. That sounds like a whole list of amazing experiences. How beautiful. Is there, would your website be the best place for us to link in the show notes for people to kind of like see all of those and look at more of the details about them?
I have 2 websites, and the website that houses my events primarily is at resilienceinformedtherapy.com.
Okay.
And then there's also drarielleschwartz.com. It houses my blog. It houses the yoga link signups and so forth. And I'll just put a shout out to one other thing, because I've had a lot of other EMDR therapists that have been sharing with me that they're using this in sessions and it's really helping, like setting the focus of a session and intention around it. But the product is a card deck that I created that integrates my love of nature photography. In fact, there's even a leopard from South Africa in the card deck. It combines photos of nature with quotes from the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook.
Oh, cool.
And then it helps clients identify kind of where are they in their healing process. Am I building resources? Am I doing a deeper dive into my trauma material? Am I integrating those resources? And they can choose cards with images and phrases to support them in their journey.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I've seen that, again, just kind of looking at different things for this episode. And I wondered, oh, this is interesting. I wonder what this is for. Yeah, Arielle, that's lovely. Well, all of that will be shared in the show notes, and I'll be sure to reference both of those websites. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much wisdom with our listeners. Really appreciate the time that you've gifted us today.
Thank you. It's really a joy to talk about this, again, the highway and being able to shift the lanes. Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, I'll stop the recording and then we'll say goodbye off air. Thank you so much.